We got some big news for fans of marsupials that like to hang upside down. That's right, Limited Run Games just announced their newest classic games compilation. And it's none other than Rocket Knight Adventures Resparked. That brings 3 classic 16-bit action platformers together in one exciting package, including the original Rocket Knight Adventures on the Genesis, Sparkster on the Super NES, and of course the Genesis sequel, Sparkster Rocket Knight Adventures 2. That's really cool news and all, but are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, MegaTech, Die Hard Game Fan, and other classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. So quit hanging around because it's time for another high-flying installment of Limited Run Review Crew.
This little piggy went to market. This little piggy stayed home. This little piggy squealed when I smoked him like a greasy slab of sausage.
Go, Freddy! Join Sparkster to crush the swine army in Konami's Rocket Knight Adventures for Sega Genesis. Unleash your animal urges with the only possum to hang with. Pigs fly with a flash of his sword and he's rocket-powered.
I love the smell of bacon in the morning.
Play Possum on Rocket Knight Adventures from Konami.
With killer franchises that include Contra, Gradius, and of course Castlevania, Konami was once the go-to publisher when you wanted a high-quality action game that was sure to be great. Unfortunately, they were not the place you go to when you wanted a cartoony platformer in the early 1990s. Enter Rocket Knight Adventures, Konami's answer to the cute and cuddly mascot craze that had been spurred on by the success of Sonic the Hedgehog. In a lot of ways, this game is the perfect marriage between what you'd expect in a mascot platformer and the traditional Konami action game, complete with an opossum hero with a big sword and a fresh suit of armor. He hacks, he slashes, he flies, and occasionally he hangs upside down. Can Sonic do that? I don't think so. Now, when it came to the reviews, you're going to find a surprising variety of takes. Let's go ahead and start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who you'll see is right in the middle of the pack. Getting a capsule review and an 8 out of 10 from all 5 editors, EGM concluded that Sparkster is one awesome possum. Konami offers the Genesis another great game with this flying critter. Plenty of levels, technique, and great graphics to keep even the most hardened game veterans entertained. With that bite-sized review, EGM gave Rocket Knight Adventures an average score of 8 out of 10. It's probably worth mentioning that there were other magazines that fell into that middle ground, including Hyper, who gave the game an 84% in their first issue, and Force Mega settling on a 79% in their third. This is also in line with the 4 out of 5 score we saw in GamePro, who called it good solid fun. The graphics may not be mean enough to suit the dark fancy of some hack-and-slash fanatics, but Sparkster's jet-propelled speed will blow your doors off, and the action swings. If you have a taste for a fast fight and fried pork, too, stick Rocket in your pocket. Now, when it comes to the detractors, Rocket Knight definitely had a couple. For example, Video Games Magazine wasn't as hot on the hero, giving the first installment a 7 out of 10. That's the same score you saw over at Edge, who reviewed the platformer with the biggest eye roll that they could muster. The current trend of cute-looking but intrinsically hard characters continues with Konami's Rocket Knight Adventures. This shrew-like rodent is blessed with a missile-slinging sword and a rocket pack. The gameplay is pretty much spot on, with just the right amount of platform action and enemies, plus a nicely balanced difficulty curve. But sadly, it sticks to the same old level boss structure. No marks for innovation here. If you can restrain from your cheating tendencies, Rocket Knight Adventure provides a neat twist on the aged platform theme. If you're looking for some high scores, then you have some to choose from. Computer and Video Games ended up giving the little guy an 88%, while Mean Machines went a little higher with a 91%. That's also the same score you saw over at Die Hard Game Fan, so remember that, because I have a hunch that that's going to come into play later on. The highest score that I could find came from UK magazine MegaTech, They praised the presentation, singling out the highly polished, smart intros, as well as the good animation, attractive colors, and the big sprites. They're also impressed with the loads of variety and the great gameplay. They ultimately concluded that Rocket Knight Adventures is a great game. Very original and playable, but none too tough. One of the best Mega Drive platformers around. Get it? Look, I agree. This was a great way to kick off the Rocket Knight series. After you play this game, it'll be easy to see why the fans were so desperate to see more of this unorthodox hero. Let's move on to Sparkster. After both the critical and the commercial success of the 1993 original, Konami rushed out two different sequels. Sparkster, Rocket Knight Adventures 2 on the Genesis, and a Super NES game that was simply called Sparkster. Believe it or not, both of these games were released in October of 1994, just 14 months after the first game hit store shelves. The first game we're going to talk about is Sparkster on the Super NES, which is neither a continuation of the 1993 game, nor is it a port of the similarly titled Genesis outing. This is a completely different game, with all new levels and a slightly different story, though many aspects of the gameplay definitely remain the same. Let's go ahead and see if the critics were impressed with the Super NES follow-up. Now once again, Electronic Gaming Monthly found themselves right in the middle of the pack with an 8.2 out of 10, which is slightly higher than the Genesis original. It's also worth mentioning that, yet again, they couldn't give poor Sparkster more than a capsule review on the side of a page. For that reason, let's go ahead and start things off with GamePro instead, who ended up going with a score of 4.5, which is the exact same score that they gave the first installment. Sparkster isn't as fresh as the original Rocket Knight. The play control should have been improved, and new weapons would have been nice. Still, Rocket Knight rookies will do well with Sparkster. Speaking of magazines that gave Sparkster the exact same score as Rocket Knight Adventure, that perfectly describes Video Games Magazine, who gave both games a 7 out of 10. That is not, however, the lowest score that I could find. Instead, we have to dig into Nintendo Power's 66th issue, where they gave it a disappointing 3.2 out of 5. They praised the excellent graphics and play control, as well as the variety and cool moves, but complained about the repetitious enemies and that there's nothing really new in theme or gameplay. I mean, do they not see that Sparkster can hang upside down? Much like the original, most of the critics liked this game. You saw Die Hard Game Fan give it an average score of 86% in their 22nd issue, all while Super Play went with a slightly more generous 89%. And then there's Game Players, who gave the game a 93% and spent the entire review praising the original Genesis game. From rich, colorful backgrounds to high-tech wizardry, this game has it all, explains Chris. He liked Sparkster's hip new look and praised the fine score and standard Konami quality sound effects, as well as the new levels like riding a turbo-speed robot ostrich. That said, even with the higher score, he complained that even with a password system, you end up starting over anyway, and noted that the shooting level, while new, isn't really very much fun. Overall, he called it a top-notch action game and even suggested Genesis owners track down the original. You know, assuming that they overlooked it the first time around. Now, while the average score is down slightly from the original, it's clear that the critics really did like this franchise. Let's see if that continues with the Sega Genesis sequel. Released the exact same month as the similarly titled Super NES game, Sparkster Rocket Knight Adventures 2 is the Genesis sequel that fans had been waiting for. As the name suggests, the story picks up following the events of the first game, where a new global threat arises. Wait, did I say new? On second thought, it's basically just a repeat of what happened in the first game, right down to the kidnapping of Princess Cherry, who is, you guessed it, the cousin of Princess Sherry. This sends our heavily armored hero into action, setting up a bunch of gorgeous levels, clever bosses, and fast-paced fun. This may have been enough to satisfy fans, but how did the Genesis version of Sparkster stack up against its Super NES counterpart? If you asked Electronic Gaming Monthly, they'd tell you that this is the worst game in the 16-bit series. They gave it an average of 7.2 out of 10, a full point lower than the Super NES counterpart. The frustrating thing is that we're now 3 games into this beloved series, and EGM didn't even bother to give one single game the full review crew treatment. Once again, we get just a capsule review that concludes that given a meaner, leaner look, Sparkster comes off pretty well in this sequel to Rocket Knight Adventures. Some of the attacks are different and take some getting used to, but overall, a good action title for the Genesis. It could use a few more colors, and the sound effects are a nice complement to the overall game. Now, unlike the other 2 titles, this is not the middle ground. AGM's review is actually the basement for Sparkster on the Genesis, with literally every other review being considerably higher. For example, you saw Australian magazine Hyper give the game an impressive 87%. Video Games Magazine actually preferred this game over the other 2 installments, giving this Genesis sequel a series high score of 8 out of 10. You also saw a series high for GamePro, who settled on a 4.5 out of 5, which is half a point higher than either of the other 2 games. Despite some minor flaws, Sparkster's a good progression from the original. The 4 difficulty levels don't just add more enemies, they actually throw fresh sections at you. You'll have your hands full. Whether Sparkster saves Princess Cherry is up to you, but the path to victory is a real blast. If you're looking for even higher scores, then let me draw your attention to Mean Machine Sega, who gave the 16-bit sequel a score of 91%, the same score that they gave the original. Game players liked it more than either version, going as high as a 94%. And speaking of magazines that went higher, that brings us to Die Hard Game Fan, who thought that the Genesis installment was easily the best in the series. The Inquirer ended up giving the game a high score of 95%, raving that Sparkster Genesis is absolutely intense. This game has a totally different feel from last year's version. New, longer levels, new play mechanics, new bosses, and gameplay that no other company can deliver. Skid also loved the game, giving it a 92%. Wow, I had no idea that a sequel could be so much better than the original. Rocket Knight Adventures was a good game. Sparkster is a great game. Graphically, Sparkster delivers big with mega line scrolls and special effects. And the music is just perfect. The levels are long, too. Do not pass this one up. While I definitely prefer the original over either of the follow-ups, I agree with Skid when he tells you to not miss out on the Rocket Knight Adventures franchise. These are great games that are well worth preserving, so I can't wait to check out the upcoming collection from Limited Run Games. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes pretty much every time Limited Run re-releases classic games. We also do the same thing with the Nintendo Switch Online, so go check out our playlist if you have a couple of hours to spare. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite Konami series? This is a good one, but between Contra and Castlevania and Metal Gear, Konami has a lot of great franchises to talk about. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with more reviews. Oh, and next week, we're going to announce our first big series of 2024. I don't want to spoil anything, but it involves giving out real physical games. Yeah, I'm going to mail them to you. You'll definitely want to be there for that announcement. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,